Hey guys, it's the Metal Blade 5, and welcome to my response to Death Battle, Gray vs. Esdeath. It's been a long time since there was a Death Battle I've had doubts with and possess good knowledge on at least one of the characters. I considered responding to Sasuke vs. Hiei when that came out, but I lacked the knowledge and maths expertise to be comfortable to do it. But this is a different story with Fairy Tail involved, and Gray being tied with Natsu for my favorite character in the series. While my only prior knowledge of Akame ga Kill is that everyone dies at the end, and the only things I knew about Esdeath were that she has ice powers and is ironically hot. I kept an open mind and waited to see both characters' analyses before deciding who I think would win. And when that time came, I immediately thought it'd be Esdeath. While that was the case for what Death Battle claim, with one of the lamest deaths I've ever seen, it was a similar case to Scrooge vs. Shovel Knight, where I felt their conclusions were based on flawed research, as I found various parts of said research to be questionable. This led me to conducting my own research on Akame ga Kill, Esdeath, and her powers, with some interesting results. In addition to having a bunch of issues with the research on Gray, leading to more research for fact-checking purposes. I don't know if my findings would necessarily change the outcome of the fight, but it does demonstrate my main problem with this episode. As opposed to my previous Death Battle responses, I think the research and how it was presented was honestly done poorly, as they either failed to consider or missed important factors with both characters, which could very well affect the results if those are being included as I think they should have been. As per usual, this isn't me hating on Death Battle, just that I think mistakes were made with this episode which I feel need addressing. Going over the conclusion portion of the video and presenting my findings where appropriate for each point they make.
Let's get to this. This was certainly an interesting matchup, and both cryomancers held their own advantages.
Oh yeah, Gray's awesome ice make powers meant he had a ton of versatility at his frosty fingertips. Like how he could eat ice to replenish his magic. She sure didn't see that one coming.
Though being the tactician she is, Esdeath likely wouldn't fall for any of Gray's tricks more than once.
I find this statement to be very strange. So, Esdeath wouldn't fall for Gray eating ice multiple times, so she just wouldn't use ice anymore from that point? Unless I'm misinterpreting what you mean, that's the only conclusion I can draw from this. While Esdeath is a proficient sword fighter, she is almost entirely reliant on her ice powers in combat, as her sword is the only part of her arsenal that doesn't involve the use of her Tegu. So nearly all of her abilities would be locked out from her pretty much straight from the get-go, putting her at a big disadvantage. For instance, if Gray managed to cut off one of her limbs, she would have to replace it with ice. I also find this statement to be contradictory, as for the rest of the conclusion, they say that Esdeath wins because her ice powers are stronger than Gray's, immediately after saying she would avoid using those powers. Additionally, from doing my research, I found a weakness Esdeath has that is never brought up in this video. Granted, it isn't a major weakness, but I think it's still something worth noting. Esdeath's sadism often leads to her toying with her opponents in fights, where she'll repeatedly inflict pain and punishment for her own pleasure rather than killing them at the earliest opportunity. And with Gray being the stripper he is, that would probably make her feel even kinkier. So by prolonging the fight, Gray would have more time to potentially get the upper hand and be able to control the whole situation much more easily. Esdeath could possibly even resort to some of her ice powers depending on what kind of punishment she'd want to inflict. So much for that tactician mind.
Also, both were in the same range of speed by scaling to feats of dodging lightning.
Yeah, but the Queen of Cold Kink definitely had more ice power up her sleeves. Just look at those storms. The one Gray scales to covered a country, while Esdeath's covered a whole continent.
True, but we still had to deduce the exact nature and potential of her storm. Remember, Esdeath specifically claimed it took her a few days to make the ice cavalry she used as fuel for the storm. A few generally means 3 at minimum, so we can cut the yield of our previous calculation to 1/3. Lowballing this a bit, let's assume she used all of her power each day to make 1/3 of the total cavalry. This would mean Esdeath could wield about 93 petatons worth of energy on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's way more than Invel's Ice Storm, and 1,600 times deadlier than that meteor Urza obliterated. Esdeath definitely had the advantage in sheer magic power. Even with his better resistances, there's no way Gray could survive that much magic force.
So with Esdeath's Storm, this was the thing I found the most questionable from the analyses and conclusions, which applies to Invel's Storm as well. Why are these storms being measured in tons of TNT? They aren't a physical destructive force like other Death Battle strength feats, such as destroying a mountain, which is made of rock and stone that requires a lot of force to break. This is just changing the weather over a large area. Weather modification in real life is done through chemical reactions, not blowing shit up. All I did was make it cold and windy. I don't see how that can take as much force to accomplish as most other strength feats, let alone being stronger than them. If they performed some sort of ice blast that had the aftermath of creating a snowstorm, I would understand this more, but that isn't the case. Invel's Storm is shown to be created by a bunch of mist, and while I couldn't find an exact clip of Esdeath creating her storm in the anime, from how it looks in the manga, it doesn't appear to be much different. When checking lists of Esdeath's greatest strength feats, the storm never came up. Rather, it was credited to her one-shotting Tyrant. In my research, I looked up how to calculate the force of creating a storm, and found that this is measured in joules, which I think is a more reasonable alternative. It also gave me the energy needed to make storms of varying sizes. So what I did was, I looked at the amount required for making a storm the size of the Indian Ocean, which is much bigger than the size of Esdeath's Storm. I took the highest possible amount needed, and put it into a converter from joules to tons of TNT, and it gave me a result of 1.5 trillion, which is 1.5 teratons of TNT. That is over 30 times weaker than Urza's meteor feat that you scaled Gray to with a larger storm. Dividing that result by a third like you did makes Esdeath's power even lower. Of course, I may not have done the best research, and there could potentially be some mistakes in the calculations I found, but the fact that I got such a drastically different result than what they claim suggests their results may need some double checking. It's also possible that their calculation for the meteor feat is inaccurate as well, but coming from a non-science mind, I think it's safe to assume it would require more force to destroy a meteor, something physical, than it would to make a really big snowstorm. Especially when said meteor was so big that it was stated to be able to wipe out everything within the battlefield that the guilds and the Alvarez Empire were fighting on. And that was a huge battlefield. Also, keep in mind that most of Urza's bones were broken when she did this. So if you really are going to scale Gray to Urza, then it's likely that her maximum strength is much greater than this. Plus, I have issues with their choice to divide the power of the storm by a third, as not only is a few very vague and can't be guaranteed to be free, but in that same line, Esdeath says she was making the Ice Cavaliers one by one. So I think a better approach would be to divide the storm's power by the number of Ice Cavaliers she made in that time. I counted 63 in this panel, but there could be more. The better strength feat to compare would have been the explosion made by this big guy. Although this is something else I found questionable. The animation of the explosion looks similar to that of a nuclear bomb. Prior Death Battle feats that have been compared to nukes are usually in the range of gigatons, yet they claim this was equivalent to 913 teratons of TNT, which seems like a bit of an overestimate. Their only reasoning behind this number is the size of the crater it made, and as Death Battle doesn't explain how exactly they do their calculations, that's all I have to go off of. The largest crater ever made by a nuke was 2,000 meters in diameter, which is 204 times smaller than the crater made here. That nuke was equivalent to 15 megatons of TNT, so I multiplied that by 204 to get a result of 3 gigatons. Again, there may be some flaws in how I did this, but getting such a different result could suggest this needs double checking as well. Esdeath has another weakness that I found in my research that is also never mentioned in this video, which gives her a major limitation to her ice powers. Whenever she uses her powers to a large extent, she gets tired out and needs to rest before using them again. The part where I see this brought up is in relation to her freezing an entire lake, which is a feat on a much smaller scale compared to her continent-sized storm. Therefore, if she were to use an attack on a similar level to her storm, she would need time to recharge, and considering her storm may not be as strong as claimed, combined with Gray's normal cold resistance and outright immunity to ice through eating it with his Devil Slayer magic, he could very well survive that and be given an opportunity to finish her off. Though he would need the durability to survive such an attack, and oddly, they never covered the durability of either character. This takes me to a big problem I had with Gray's analysis. All the information they looked at and gave was only from the original fairy tale. 100-Year Quest is never even mentioned, which doesn't make any sense as it's the sequel series, is written by Mishima, and is canon. So I have no idea why this seemingly was never considered during research, as one would expect the characters to be even stronger there due to more time passing. As such, I started looking up things that happened in a 100-Year Quest, and found something of utmost importance. In one chapter, Natsu fought and defeated the water dragon god named Mercphobia, which sounds like a fear of mercenaries. Obviously, Natsu is a dragon slayer, but fire dragon slayer magic doesn't have any outright defensive or resistant to dragon properties. Aside from fire resistance and consuming it, it's purely offensive. And Natsu was able to tank hits from this guy. When researching Mercphobia's power output, I discovered that he is at continent level strength, as the 5 dragon gods are each stated to be at least as strong as Acnologia, who at his max power was able to unleash blasts that were compared to a Furion, a form of magic stated to be strong enough to destroy entire nations in one blast. As Gray is constantly butting heads with Natsu and showing to fight on par with him, this would mean that Gray's durability is insanely high with how Death Battle likes to scale its characters. Meanwhile with Esdeath, I had more trouble finding a definitive max durability for her with proof. The highest I've seen claimed is country level, as she could take hits from Akame's powered up form. Lastly, one point about Gray that I felt was at least worth mentioning is that he has prior experience of fighting other ice wizards like Leon, Silver, and Invel. Even Ultir used a little bit of ice make magic in their fights. Some of them have techniques similar to Esdeath's, and most of them possessed ice magic that was superior to Gray's at the time, yet he still won.
This maker magic you wield is an inferior derivative of true ice wizardry. I can shatter your spells with barely any effort.
A few moments later.
You're the one who's gonna shatter!
So he really only had one shot, the Lost Ice Shell.
Which certainly could have ended things right then and there, if not for Esdeath's time stop ability. Both the Ice Shell and Mahoptima could only be used once, but Mahoptima was more useful given its immediate effect compared to the Ice Shell's long casting time, and its versatility in that Esdeath could follow it up with whatever she wanted.
Also, it doesn't kill her, so that's a plus.
Sure.
Esdeath's time stop is definitely her ace in the hole that can allow her to win this. However, the Mahoptima or whatever has downsides that never got brought up in this episode. On top of it being usable once per day, it drains Esdeath's stamina while it's in effect, and it only lasts for a short amount of time. Meaning she really needs to land a fatal blow in this moment or she could be screwed. I also don't like how you consider the Ice Shell to be Gray's ultimate technique when he never actually uses it. Both times he was about to do it, Natsu stopped him. If any of what I said earlier is even remotely right, then Gray might not even have to rely on the Ice Shell at all. What's more is that Gray does have a more deserving ultimate technique that is, once again, never mentioned or even listed in his arsenal. Ice Make Unlimited. This allows Gray to create a ton of ice constructs in rapid, continuous succession without the usual brief casting period that ice make magic has. It was how he was able to beat Rufus, as he could make ice weapons and attack with them faster than Rufus could memorize it or counter with his memory make magic. And you do list Gray defeating Rufus in his feats, so I don't know how you were unaware of this move. Regardless, Gray is also being shown to create huge amounts of ice in such a short amount of time and flash freeze many people at once on numerous occasions. Neither may be as good as Esdeath's, but it's certainly more impressive than how a lot of it is made out in this episode. Honestly, this episode gave me the impression that Death Battle knows nothing about Fairy Tail, due to all the things they missed out, alongside them jumping on the bandwagon with the "Fairy Tail is all about the power of friendship" crap.
Which works out since this is the sort of world where fighting for your friends actually increases your magical power. True story.
Even though it's straight up said that magic is powered by its users' emotions. Yeah, it's still really cheesy, but it's not the same thing. The only time friendship is used as a power source is for the Fairy Sphere, and that was only used twice in the whole series. They don't even call Deliora by name. They just call him the Demon, even though his name would appear all over the place if you simply look up Gray's backstory.
Technically, Gray's Ice Devil Slayer magic means he could probably resist the Mahoptopotamus a bit. But that brat Tatsumi had crazy good cold resistance too, and it didn't do him much good against the time freeze.
I think it's unfair to compare Gray's cold resistance to Tatsumi's here. Tatsumi's Tegu had only recently evolved to grant Tatsumi cold resistance, while Gray got his cold resistance from his training from not his Devil Slayer magic, which was when he was a kid. So not only has Gray had a strong resistance to cold for much longer than Tatsumi, but he also had more extensive training with it. That's what the whole stripper thing is about, which you even said earlier, and more experience with it. Gray's natural body temperature is also very cold because of his proficiency in ice magic. So I think that Gray would have the resistance to be able to move for a decent amount of time during the time stop. Not a lot, but a noticeable amount longer than Tatsumi. Potentially having a decent enough window to counter it with something that just might work. Devil Slayer magic. Esdeath's time stop isn't a simple Zawarudo! It's done by her literally freezing time with cold temperature. The general consensus for how this works appears to be that she drops the temperature to below absolute zero. At that temperature, ice particles will have formed in the air, which Gray could eat with his Devil Slayer magic to replenish himself, so he could possibly be revitalized to the point that he could survive most things Esdeath could do to him while time is stopped, or make enough distance that she wouldn't be able to reach him before the time stop ends. What's more, and this is complete speculation on my part here, is given how Ice Devil Slayers eating ice is shown to absorb the entire body of ice, what if Gray, eating all these ice particles, just absorbed all of the frozen space and thus neutralized the time stop altogether? Then Esdeath would have wasted her one use of it and she'd be left drained of stamina while Gray would be totally restored, leaving her in a very bad spot to say the least. That was everything I had to say in response to Death Battle's result for this fight. It seems like they really highballed Esdeath by excluding her weaknesses and giving her strength calculations that were ridiculously high, which I think were extreme inaccurate overestimates, while severely lowballing Gray by missing out a bunch of important stuff for him, completely excluding a 100-year quest from the research, and just getting some details outright wrong or not considering the full circumstances around some of the events they mentioned. Taking into account my research and calculations, if the latter are more accurate, it appears to be more of a toss-up on who has the greater strength. Esdeath is most likely faster in both movement speed and overall casting time, and has more total combat experience, while Gray has the superior defense, greater versatility, and more experience with using and fighting those with ice powers. It seems like this will be a war of attrition that ultimately comes down to what wins out between the time stop and Devil Slayer magic in a Mexican standoff, rather than the almost totally one-sided in favor of Esdeath as they present in the video. Kinda think there should have been a do-over here. Now I wait for people to say I'm wrong and stupid, some of which may just be because I like Fairy Tail, or for others to make a drinking game or B-movie meme from how many times the word ice was said in this video. And as I wait for most likely the former to come, I'll see you guys for my next response video.